A late-night thunderstorm raged as Eric drove along the winding back roads, his wipers working overtime against the sheets of rain pounding the windshield. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, the headlights barely cutting through the dense curtain of rain. It was the kind of night that made everything feel off, like the world around him had turned hostile. He had been on his way to visit his brother in a small town miles away, but the storm had forced him off the main highway and now he was lost. His gas gauge was edging toward empty, and he hadn't seen a sign of life for miles, just endless trees swaying violently in the wind. Then, just when his anxiety was at its peak, a gas station appeared out of nowhere, its dim lights flickering through the downpour. It looked old, abandoned almost, but the pumps were still on. A single, rusted sign swung in the wind, creaking ominously. "Gas and go!" Eric pulled in, relief flooding through him as he parked under the awning, his car's engine sputtering out the last of its fuel. He stepped out into the storm, pulling his jacket tighter around him as he hurried to the pump. The rain was icy cold, biting at his skin. The station was eerily quiet, save for the howling wind and the rattling of the loose sign. He fumbled with his wallet and slid his card into the reader, only to be greeted with a flashing error message. "Card not accepted." "Great," Eric muttered under his breath. He glanced toward the small, decrepit store attached to the station. The windows were fogged over, and the inside looked dark. He wasn't even sure it was open, but with no other choice, he ran toward the building, the rain soaking to the bone by the time he reached the door. He pushed it open, the old bell above door letting out a broken, metallic ring. The inside of the store was no better. The air was thick with the smell of mold, and the shelves were nearly bare, stocked with dusty cans and outdated candy. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered like they were struggling to stay on. A single employee stood behind the counter, his back turned to Eric, fiddling with something below the register. Excuse me?" Eric called, his voice shaky from the cold. The man didn't respond, didn't even turn around. Eric walked closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty store. "Hey, my card isn't working at the pump. Do you?" Before he could finish, the man turned around and Eric's words died in his throat. The employee's face was horribly wrong, his skin pale and waxy, his eyes sunken deep into dark, hollow sockets. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin far too wide for his face, showing jagged teeth that seemed too sharp, too unnatural. Eric took an instinctive step back, his pulse quickening. "What's wrong with your face?" The man didn't answer, didn't blink. His eyes, dark and lifeless, locked onto Eric, that twisted grin frozen in place. Eric's breath caught in his throat as the man slowly raised one bony hand pointing toward the door. His arm moved stiffly, unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. Eric didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, the bell clanging loudly as he shoved it open and dashed into the rain. He slipped on the wet pavement but caught himself, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back. He jumped into his car, fumbling with the keys, his hands trembling. The engine sputtered to life, and Eric peeled out of the lot, his tires spinning on the slick asphalt. The gas gauge was still dangerously low, but he didn't care. He had to get away from that place, from whatever that thing was. As he sped down the road, trying to shake the image of the man's face from his mind, the rain seemed to intensify, hammering against the car with renewed fury. His hands shook on the wheel, adrenaline coursing through his veins. That's when he saw it. In his rearview mirror, a figure was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by his taillights through the rain. It was the man from the gas station, grinning that same twisted grin. His clothes hung loosely from his body, drenched from the storm, but he stood perfectly still, like the rain didn't affect him. Eric's heart slammed against his ribs. There was no way the man could have followed him that fast. He pressed harder on the gas, his car skidding as it rounded a curve. The road ahead split off, and without thinking, Eric veered onto the right fork, hoping to lose whatever was behind him. But as he glanced into the mirror again, his blood ran cold. The man was closer now, impossibly close, standing just a few feet behind the car. His face was pressed up against the back window, that awful grin never faltering, his hollow eyes staring into Eric's soul. Eric swerved off the road, the car jerking violently as it hit the gravel shoulder. His heart pounded as he glanced back again, but the man was gone. The road was empty. Eric's breaths came in ragged gasps. He slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road, the storm still raging around him. He stared into the rearview mirror, waiting for something, anything, to reappear. But there was nothing, just the rain and the empty road stretching behind him. After a long moment, Eric forced himself to take a deep breath. He had to keep moving. Whatever had happened back at the gas station, it didn't make sense. Maybe the storm had messed with his mind. Maybe it was exhaustion. He rubbed his eyes and started the car again, determined to put as much distance between himself and that place as possible. But as he turned back onto the road, something caught his eye. A small slip of paper wedged under his windshield wiper. His stomach twisted in knots as he leaned out of the window to grab it, his hand trembling. The paper was soaked, the ink running in the rain, but the message was still clear. See you soon. Eric's blood ran cold as he stared at the note, his heart pounding in his chest. He crumpled the paper in his hand and floored the gas, the car lurching forward as he sped into the night. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out in the darkness, that grinning man was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to appear again. Late one night, somewhere off a desolate highway, Mia was driving home after visiting her parents for the weekend. It was a familiar route, but her gas gauge was dangerously close to empty, so she kept her eyes peeled for the next station. The road was silent except for the occasional gust of wind sweeping across the barren landscape, pushing dried leaves into the path of her headlights. A sign appeared out of the darkness, weathered and barely legible. Gas station, 2 miles ahead. Relieved, she slowed her car, anticipation creeping into her exhausted body. As she approached, the gas station emerged from the shadows like something forgotten. Its lone, flickering light cast long shadows over the cracked asphalt, and the sign above the station buzzed with electrical interference. Mia pulled in, the crunch of gravel beneath her tires echoing in the emptiness. There were no other cars around. The only sound was the hum of the old gas pumps and the eerie rustling of trees lining the edges of the lot. She parked by the nearest pump and stepped out, the cold night air biting at her skin. A thin mist began to creep along the ground, making the place feel even more isolated. She swiped her card and started pumping gas, watching as the numbers on the meter climbed. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her trance. It was a message from her friend Sarah, asking how far she had left to drive. Mia started typing a response but then froze when she heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniably human. A faint sobbing. Mia glanced around. There was no one in sight. The gas station was still, almost too still. She turned back to the pump, shaking her head. Maybe it was her imagination, the late hour playing tricks on her mind. But just as she convinced herself it was nothing, the sound came again. Closer, more distinct. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She slowly scanned the lot, her eyes darting from one shadow to another. Nothing. But the sobbing grew louder, echoing off the walls of the darkened convenience store behind the pumps. She squinted toward the building, and through the dirty windows, she could just make out the faintest glint of movement. Her pulse quickened. She yanked the gas nozzle out and screwed the cap back on, her hands trembling. Just as she was about to get into her car, something made her stop. Curiosity gnawed at her. What if someone inside needed help? Against her better judgment, Mia took a hesitant step toward the convenience store. The sobbing was clearer now, like someone crying quietly in the dark. She peered inside through the smeared window, her breath fogging up the glass. The store's interior was dimly lit, shelves half empty, and an old cash register sat on the counter, covered in dust. She saw no one, but the sobbing continued, now sounding as if it were right behind her. Mia spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but again, nothing. The mist was thickening, swallowing the edges of the lot, making the world beyond the gas station dissolve into a hazy blur. Panic started to settle in her stomach. Suddenly, the sobbing stopped. The abrupt silence was worse. She felt every nerve in her body tingle, waiting, expecting something to happen. The door to the convenience store creaked open just a crack, as if pushed by a slight breeze, though the air was completely still. Her breath caught. She stared at the door, willing her legs to move back to her car, to get the hell out of there. But she remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and morbid curiosity. "Miss?" a voice whispered from the darkness inside the store. Mia's heart nearly stopped. The voice was trembling, fragile. "Miss, please. Can you help me?" The voice came again, more desperate this time. It sounded like a young woman, scared, pleading. She took a step forward, then stopped herself. Something was wrong. Why hadn't she seen anyone inside? She swallowed hard, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but the voice sounded so real, so broken. "Who's there?" Mia called, her voice shaking. There was no response. The door creaked wider, revealing more of the shadowy interior. Mia's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and for a moment, she saw nothing. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement. Someone crouched in the far corner, just beyond the reach of the dim light. A figure, a young woman, huddled against the wall, her face hidden by long, matted hair. Mia's stomach churned. She couldn't tell if the woman was injured or just terrified. Every part of her screamed to run, but the woman's sobbing tugged at her conscience. I'll get help," Mia stammered, backing away. The woman suddenly raised her head, and Mia's blood turned to ice. Her face was gaunt, eyes wide and hollow, with the dark circles etched deeply under them. She stared at Mia, unblinking, her lips trembling. "Don't leave me," the woman whispered, her voice low and guttural. It no longer sounded like a plea. It sounded like a threat. Mia stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears. She turned and ran to her car, her feet barely touching the ground. She fumbled with the keys, her shaking hands making it impossible to get them into the ignition. Behind her, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, grew louder, crunching the gravel. She didn't dare look back. The door to the store slammed shut, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer, closing in. Finally, Mia managed to start the car. Without looking back, she slammed her foot on the gas and sped out of the station, the tires screeching as they tore out of the lot. As she flew down the highway, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the haze of mist, she saw the gas station fading into the distance, and standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible in the fog, was the woman, watching her. Mia didn't stop driving until she was miles away, and even then, the feeling of those hollow eyes on her never left. Later, when she tried to tell her friends about what happened, they dismissed it as fatigue or an overactive imagination. But Mia knew what she saw. Curious, she looked up the station online, hoping to find an explanation. What she found chilled her to the bone. Years ago, the gas station had been the site of a violent incident. A young woman had been abducted from there, never to be seen again. Some say she still lingers, waiting for someone to help her, just as Mia had seen. Others say she's looking for something else entirely. Mia never drove that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when she's alone in her apartment, she swears she can still hear the faint sound of sobbing. It was a little past midnight when Jenna realized she was running low on gas. She cursed under her breath, regretting not filling up before leaving town. The winding back roads were quiet, empty, except for the occasional flicker of a passing light in the distance. The radio was her only companion, softly playing old tunes to keep her mind off the creeping loneliness of the drive. A gas station sign appeared ahead, lit by a flickering bulb that seemed to barely cling to life. Harper's Gas, open 24 hours, the weather-beaten sign read. Jenna sighed with relief and pulled in. The place looked ancient. 2 rusted gas pumps stood in front of a small, dilapidated building. The windows were dark, save for a single dim light coming from inside. Jenna got out of the car, the night air biting at her exposed skin. The gas station seemed frozen in time. She could almost smell the rust in the air, mingling with the scent of wet pavement. As she approached the pump, she noticed a worn-out cash-only sign taped to the side. Of course. She glanced toward the small shop where a faint shadow moved behind the dirty glass. Maybe the clerk had changed. With a huff, she headed toward the entrance, her boots crunching on the gravel as she went. The door creaked open, the hinges screaming like they hadn't been oiled in years. Inside, the store smelled of dampness and decay, as if it had been abandoned long ago. Yet there were still dusty cans and faded snack wrappers on the shelves. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the small, cluttered space. No answer. The shadow she'd seen earlier seemed to have vanished, but the cash register light blinked dimly, as if someone had recently been there. Jenna felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She wasn't easily spooked, but there was something deeply unsettling about the silence. She took another step forward, glancing down the narrow aisles. Still no sign of anyone. Then, suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into near darkness. Jenna's heart skipped a beat as she fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. A low hum filled the air, a sound too faint to identify but unmistakably present. It was like something was alive beneath the quiet, a presence she could almost feel brushing against her skin. As she swung the beam of her flashlight around, it landed on something that made her breath catch in her throat. In the corner, behind the shelves, was a figure. A man. At least, it looked like a man, stood motionless, his back turned to her. He was tall, with unnaturally long limbs and a thin, lanky frame. His clothes hung loosely from his body, wet and tattered, as if he had been standing in the rain for hours. "Hey," Jenna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you work here?" The figure didn't move. She took a small step forward, the floor creaking beneath her. The man's head tilted slightly, just enough for her to see a sliver of his profile. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the beam of her light, and his eyes were completely black. No pupils, no whites, just empty, dark voids staring at her from the side of his face. A wave of nausea hit her as the air around her grew colder. Jenna's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her body refused to obey. Her breath quickened, and her fingers tightened around her phone as if the faint light from the flashlight could protect her from whatever this thing was. Then, in a slow, jerky motion, the figure turned toward her. Its grin was grotesque, lips pulling back too far, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Jenna gasped, stumbling back into a shelf, knocking over cans that clattered to the ground. The man, or whatever it was, took a step toward her, its movements slow, unnatural, as if each step caused it pain. The dim light from her phone flickered as the thing's grin widened, its teeth glistening in the faint glow. Jenna didn't wait any longer. She bolted for the door, her feet slipping on the wet floor as she ran. The sound of footsteps followed her, heavy and deliberate, each one sending a jolt of fear through her body. She reached the door, yanking it open with trembling hands, and stumbled out into the rain-soaked night. Her car was still parked by the pump, and she ran to it, heart racing, nearly falling as she scrambled for the keys in her pocket. As she fumbled with the lock, she could feel it, the presence behind her. The air was thick with it, as though something unspeakably horrible loomed just over her shoulder, waiting for her to turn around. Finally, her fingers found the key, and she shoved it into the ignition, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. The engine roared to life, and she slammed the door shut, locking it with a trembling hand. She floored the gas, speeding out of the lot, without a second glance. As she drove down the dark road, her breathing ragged, she dared to look in the rearview mirror. The gas station faded into the distance, its old lights barely visible through the downpour. But then she saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by her taillights, was the figure. It was watching her, motionless, its head slightly tilted as if listening to something only it could hear. Jenna's stomach dropped. She pressed the accelerator harder, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. She didn't stop driving for miles, not until she was sure she had left the thing far behind. When she finally reached the nearest town, her hands were still shaking, and she pulled into the first open diner she saw. As she sat in the brightly lit booth sipping coffee to calm her nerves, she pulled out her phone, curiosity gnawing at her. She had to know if there was something strange about that place. A quick search brought up an old news article, the headline catching her eye immediately. Gas station attendant murdered in Harper's gas robbery, suspect never found. Jenna's heart sank as she read on. The station had been closed for over a decade after a gruesome crime. The clerk, a man in his late 20s, had been killed by a robber, but the details were hazy. Witnesses said the body was never fully recovered, and strange sightings had been reported ever since. People claimed they saw him, his ghost, still standing behind the counter, waiting for customers who never came. Jenna dropped her phone, her blood running cold. She glanced out the window at the rain-soaked night, but this time she didn't dare look too long. She never wanted to see that gas station again. But something told her that it had seen her and wasn't done with her yet. The highway stretched out before Greg, an endless ribbon of darkness cutting through the remote countryside. He had been on the road for hours, driving through the night to reach his destination by dawn. The interstate was completely deserted except for his car, the faint hum of the engine the only sound keeping him company. As his eyelids grew heavier, Greg spotted the warm glow of neon lights in the distance. A gas station. His gas tank was half full, but the pull of caffeine and a bathroom break was too tempting. He turned off the highway and pulled into the station, its lights flickering weakly in the dead of night. The gas station sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but vast fields and the occasional stand of skeletal trees. The building itself looked old, its faded sign barely readable, and the windows were streaked with grime. But there was a solitary light on inside, casting long, eerie shadows across the parking lot. Greg got out of the car, the chill in the air biting at his skin. He shivered and zipped up his jacket, glancing around. The place was eerily quiet. No cars, no other customers, and no sign of an attendant at the register. The only sound was the distant rustling of the wind sweeping through the barren landscape. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the store, the crunch of gravel under his boots unnaturally loud in the silence. As he reached the door, he saw a hand-painted sign taped to the glass. Cash only. Greg frowned but shrugged it off. He wasn't here for gas, just a quick snack and some coffee. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the scent of old wood and musty air hit him like a wave. Inside, the gas station was even more rundown. The shelves were sparsely stocked, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently. There was no sign of an attendant behind the counter, though the cash register was on, casting a dim glow. "Hello?" Greg called out, his voice echoing in the small, empty store. No response. He stepped further inside, glancing down one of the aisles. A chill ran down his spine. He had the unsettling feeling of being watched, though the store was completely empty. He tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the isolation and the late hour. As he reached for a bag of chips, he heard it. A faint rustling sound, like something moving behind one of the shelves. Greg froze, listening intently. The sound stopped. He slowly turned his head, scanning the store, but nothing seemed out of place. His heartbeat quickened, but he forced a laugh, telling himself he was just being paranoid. Grabbing a cup of coffee from the dusty machine, he made his way to the counter. Still no sign of an attendant. He tapped the bell on the counter, the sharp ding echoing eerily in the empty store. A door behind the counter creaked open slightly, just enough for Greg to glimpse the dark room beyond. He leaned over, peering through the crack, and his stomach twisted. There was something back there, standing in the shadows. A figure, barely visible, watching him. Hello?" Greg called out again, louder this time, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. Greg's skin crawled. He couldn't make out any details, but he could feel the figure's eyes on him, boring into him from the darkness. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and he stepped back from the counter, his mind racing. Without waiting for an answer, he hurried to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the store. Greg froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly, and his blood ran cold. The figure was no longer behind the counter. It was standing in the middle of the store, between him and the door. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood or some sort of dark shadow. But the eyes, he could see them now, glowing faintly in the dim light. They weren't human. For a moment, Greg couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The figure took a slow step toward him, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet with broken strings. Greg's instincts kicked in. He lunged for the door, yanking it open with a force he didn't know he had, and stumbled outside into the cold night air. He sprinted to his car, not daring to look back. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, and he finally managed to start the engine. He sped out of the lot, tires screeching, his heart racing in his chest. The gas station disappeared in his rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. He drove for miles, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. When he finally dared to glance in the mirror again, his blood turned to ice. There in the back seat was the figure, sitting perfectly still, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Greg swerved off the road, the car skidding to a halt in a ditch. He whipped around, but the back seat was empty. No figure, no glowing eyes. Just the echo of his own ragged breathing and the oppressive silence of the night. Shaking, Greg scrambled out of the car, scanning the road and the surrounding fields for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. just the cold wind and the empty highway. His car was totaled, and his phone had no signal. He was stranded, miles from anywhere, with the gas station and the figure he had seen far behind him. But as he stood there, alone on the side of the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, it was still watching him, waiting, and it wasn't done yet.